So hello everybody. Welcome to the lecture of today. A special welcome to our lecturer of today, who is Jason Steinhauer. He's a historian and he will be introduced later in more detail by Helga Novotny, who is moderating this session of today. I'm especially happy because today we are not speaking about AI. Once upon a time, I think it's good. But also we speak on how the web and social media changed our understanding of history. So it's not only changing our society, the web, but also our understanding of history. And thanks for Jason Steinhauer to do this lecture. The choreography as normal is that we have a talk for 30 minutes, then 30 minutes Q&A moderated by Helga. And at the end, again, a piece of music chosen by Jason. This is managed by Peter. I welcome our moderator, Helga Novotny. She is Professor Emerita of ETH Zurich, and she is also the former president of the ERC. So I think I do not need to introduce Helga, but I want a special thanks to you for your ongoing support and cooperation with our initiative. You are with us from the early beginning, and thanks for that. Helga, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce Jason Steinhauer today. He's a public historian. You may wonder what is a public historian. Well, he is very much at the interface between history and public affairs, citizens, and public policy. He's the founder and CEO of the History Communication Institute, and currently he serves as a global fellow at the Wilson Center in the History and Policy Program in Washington, D.C. He has also recently joined as adjunct professor the Maxwell School for Citizenship and Public Affairs, a very renowned school in Washington, D.C., where he is in the Center for Strategic International Studies. Jason recently undertook a gruesome marathon, taking him through several European countries, starting Brussels, going on to Georgia, back to Munich, Bulgaria, North Macedonia, Hungary, but unfortunately only to the airport in Vienna. So I'm very happy that at least we can greet you here on the screen. The focus of today's talk is Jason's best-selling book, History Disrupted. And this is also how I got to know Jason, because both of us were together in a program interviewed by the BBC. And this book is very remarkable, as you will hear, because it shows indeed how, especially the distortions of history, are changing not just our understanding of history, but has repercussions on understanding politics and the society in which we live today. Jason, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Helga, for that very, very kind introduction. And it has been an honor and a privilege to get to know you over these past few months since our time on the BBC together. And I definitely hope that one day our paths will cross in Vienna or elsewhere in Europe. As was mentioned, I just came back from a 5-week, 6-country tour that was sponsored by the U.S. Department of State, where I was sent to all the places that Helga mentioned to talk about my book and also the broader ramifications of history being communicated online, both accurate history as well as inaccurate and dishonest history, and what the implications are for geopolitics and just for the broader society that we live in. It's a fascinating trip, which I'm still sort of wrapping my mind around, and I will be putting information about the trip in my newsletter in the weeks ahead. So if people are interested to kind of hear how all this ties with contemporary issues, please do subscribe to that. I'll put the link in the chat in a little bit. But for today, let me take a few minutes to tell you about some of the work that I've done in the book and also how we're translating it moving forward in the History Communication Institute. And then hopefully we can have a productive conversation, and maybe that conversation will open up pathways for partnership and collaboration moving forward around all of these issues, including actually artificial intelligence. So Han, we may actually talk about AI in this program if we get to that point in the conversation. So thank you to Helga, thank you to Han, thank you to everybody for making this possible. And I will show up some slides and get to it. So let me see if I can do that real quick. And I'm assuming everybody can see that. Great. So Helga gave you a little bit of a background about me, but let me tell you a little bit more, just to give you a kind of a clear picture of how I got into this topic in the first place. So as mentioned, I am what we call in the US and increasingly around the world a public historian. So people are probably familiar with academic history and historians who work inside universities, professors, teaching students, writing scholarly articles. But in the United States and increasingly around the world, there is this other wing of the profession that we call public history. And public history oftentimes encompasses historians who work inside museums, libraries, archives, think tanks, government agencies, etc. And that's the world that I came out of. So I began my career actually working at a Holocaust museum in Lower Manhattan called the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. My grandparents were Holocaust survivors. My mother was actually born in a displaced persons camp outside of Ulm, Germany after the Second World War, and they emigrated to Canada and from Canada to the United States. So Holocaust history has sort of personally and professionally been very important and interesting to me. And so I actually began my career working on museum exhibits about the Holocaust. The first exhibit I worked on was about American Jews who served in the Second World War, about 550,000 Jews who served in the American military during World War II. And the second exhibit I worked on was about Jewish refugees to New York City after World War II. That included Jews from Europe, but also Jews from the former Soviet Union, Jews from the Middle East, like Iraq, Iran, Egypt, Morocco, even Jews from Cuba. So from there, I actually went to work in archives and libraries. I worked at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame for a little bit, if people are familiar with that institution. I also helped to create a Jewish museum on the north coast of the Dominican Republic. I'm sure this group is aware that in 1938 at the Evian Conference, the only country that volunteered to take Jewish refugees was the Dominican Republic. And so through American philanthropy, there was actually a community of Jewish refugees established on the north coast of the DR in an abandoned banana plantation called Sosua. And so these Jews, actually some of them who were from Vienna, were brought over to the DR and they were trained to be farmers. They made their own milk, they made their own cheese. By their own admission, it was terrible milk and terrible cheese. But they survived the war there. And then afterwards, they went to Israel or the United States or South America. But there's a small community that stayed, and they have a small museum there that tells their stories. So I was actually the first person to look at the records of that community in over 50 years. From there, I went to the Library of Congress, where I worked for 7 years. This is the Library of Congress behind me. I'm not actually at the library right now, but this is the room where we used to do all of our programming. And part of my role at the library was to bring scholars from around the world to the library to conduct research and then to have them interact with members of Congress and their staff. So to bring scholars and practitioners together. And that prepared me to be the director of the LePage Center for History and the Public Interest, which I did for 4 years. That was at Villanova University. Now I'm at the Wilson Center and the author of History Disrupted. And as mentioned, I've just recently joined the Maxwell School. So why am I telling you all this? Well, I've spent my entire career thinking about how public audiences learn about the past, whether it be inside a museum gallery, inside of an archive, or on Capitol Hill. And increasingly throughout my career, it became very obvious to me that people's ideas about the past were being increasingly shaped by the information they saw on their phones. And so I just basically asked myself, what does that mean? What does it mean to try to learn history from your phone? What does it mean for people's understandings of the past that information they see about history would be, in their social media feeds or on their devices? And the more I looked into that question, the more I realized there was a much bigger story here. And so that's sort of the genesis of how this book and all these ideas I've been thinking through over the past few years have sort of come about. This is actually the inside of the Library of Congress. I hope some of you have been there and recognized this. This is the Great Hall. I actually used to work right down the hall from this. So it's a great place to walk into work every day. And it's a great place also to think big thoughts about the world. And one of the people who was thinking big thoughts about the world when I was there was this gentleman named David Grinspoon. Now, David Grinspoon is an astrobiologist, so he studies the conditions, scientific conditions for life beyond Earth. And he's a planetary scientist, but he's also something that he calls a science communicator working in the field of science communication. And this group is probably very familiar with science communication and science communicators, so I don't have to explain it. But the more I was talking with David while he was in residence with us at the library, the more I began to ask myself, why doesn't history do this? Why don't we have something called history communication? And why aren't we training people to be history communicators? Why aren't we thinking critically and analytically about how historical information gets conveyed through various media in order to ensure that accurate history informs public policy and public understandings of the past? So actually in 2015, 2016 time period, I actually suggested this to my colleagues in the US, in the public history world. I said, we should invest in something called history communication. We should train people to be history communicators, and we should think critically and analytically about how history gets conveyed through various media, including social media, in order to ensure that accurate historical information affects public policy and public understandings of the past. And you all being in academia will know that anytime you suggest a new idea in academia, there is always debate and pushback and back and forth. So this sort of stimulated a debate inside the world of public history for a few years. But of course, during this time period, as we know, 2015, 2016, 2017, social media was just increasingly becoming this huge part of all of our lives. And a lot of history started to show up on social media, a lot of history content, including videos like this. Now, some of you might be familiar with this video. You may have seen this video or read about it in my book. This video about the US Civil War received 30 million views online. Now, to put that in perspective, again, this audience will be familiar with these statistics. The average academic monograph sells 250 copies, right? 95% of all books never sell more than 1,000 copies. So my book has sold over 1,000 copies. That puts it in the top 5% of all books, right? So if I was to write a book or do an article about the Civil War, probably very few people would read it. This video about the Civil War, 30 million views online. Right. So it's clear that something was happening. Something was changing the way people understood the past, interacted with the past, learned about the past. Now, we have to have a little bit of media literacy when we think about things like views, because at one point, Facebook was counting a view as 3 seconds. So it's really not possible to, I think, view anything meaningfully in 3 seconds, right? These views are obviously used to drum up advertising numbers and to inflate all kinds of statistics that people then use to talk about their influence online. But still, 30 million views versus 250 copies of the book or 1,000 copies of the book. It's a significant difference. Now, we'll come back to this video in a bit because I want to talk more about it. But it wasn't just videos like this that were popping up online about history. It was all types of different content online. And again, a lot of these examples are largely from English, but of course you can, I'm sure if you've logged onto social media at any point in the last 6 or 7 years, you've seen things like this in German and Polish and Russian and all kinds of different formats and subject matters. But this stuff was showing up on Instagram, it was showing up on Facebook, it was showing up on Twitter, it was showing up on WhatsApp and Telegram, and no one was really looking into it. I mean, no one really understood what this stuff was, who was creating it, what the agendas were behind it, and most critically, what it was doing to people's understandings of the past, how it was affecting people's understanding about history or what they think they knew about history. Now, as I mentioned too, we were kind of aware during this period that social media was becoming this bigger and bigger part of our lives, but I feel like sometimes it's helpful to see it represented graphically. So this is actually from 2018. And this shows you every minute of every day how much social media content is created. And again, some people might be familiar with these graphics. You may have seen these in your own research. But again, 2018, right? In YouTube, in 2018 on YouTube, users watched 4.3 million videos every minute of every day. Now, I'm in the history and the humanities because I don't want to do math, but I know that that's a very large number when you multiply that by 60 minutes in an hour, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 52 weeks in a year. And actually, when I was in North Macedonia, I asked the students to try to calculate this number, and it's an absurdly large number when you start to extrapolate out how much content per year this is. But even in 2018, Twitter users sending 473,000 tweets every minute of every day. My question was, how much of this is history content? How much of this is content that purports to teach people about the past? And it's really hard to actually put a firm number on this, but some researchers in Germany I've been working with have actually started to figure it out. So on TikTok, which is not on this graph, but will be on the graph I show you in a few minutes, on TikTok, there are 58 billion posts with the hashtag history. 58 billion. Now, that number is from October of 2022. So now in June of 2023, the number is probably somewhere around 80 or 90 billion posts with the hashtag history. On Instagram, it's somewhere between 46 and 50 million posts with the hashtag history. So this is a huge category of content, right? And no one was looking at it. I mean, during this time period, we all remember there were books about social media and its effect on politics, social media, its effect on journalism. During the pandemic, social media, its effects on public health, politics, but no one had written a book about social media's effects on history. There were articles, there were edited volumes that had a couple of different authors here and there. Obviously, there were some blog posts about it, but no one had really sort of put their mind around the whole thing and tried to tackle the entire phenomenon and what it meant for people's understanding of history. So I figured I would be the person to do it. So in 2019, I wrote the first draft of the book. 2020, I wrote the second draft. 2021, the third draft. The book came out at the end of 21, beginning of 22. I've now been talking about the book for 17 months straight. This is my 145th event about the book. And as mentioned, I just came back from Europe where I was there for 32 days. I did 27 events in 32 days, plus 6 media appearances around the book. And I say this for a couple of reasons. One, when I was pitching the book to publishers, I got told over and over again by literary agents and presses that no one would read it. They told me it was too niche of a subject and that no one would actually care. And in fact, they told me that I should write a book about Trump instead, because that would be a book that people would want to read. Now, Trump actually does show up in the book in a couple of places, but I'm very glad that the book is not about Trump. I think it's a much more interesting book not being about Trump. But I think it also points out that they were wrong, right? I mean, the book has been read by a lot of people. As I mentioned, it's sold a lot of copies. It's been a bestseller in a number of different categories. I've been on NPR 4 times. The book release was filmed by C-SPAN. As mentioned, I've done the State Department tour, right? But I think the reason that the book has resonated is a couple reasons. One, we care about social media and its effect on our lives. And as mentioned, we have a lot of literature about social media's effect on all parts of our lives. But this book, I think, fills a gap in our knowledge about social media and sort of rounds out our view of social media by thinking about it not just about the present and the future, but also the past. But two, it turns out a lot of people care about history. If you think about in the United States context, at least, all the major debates that we're having, whether it be about Confederate monuments or Christopher Columbus statues or critical race theory or what books should be in what libraries or what, they all invoke history. And certainly when I was in Europe, everywhere I went, Belgium, Georgia, Hungary, North Macedonia, all public debates, geopolitical debates about contemporary issues are invoking the past. And increasingly, those debates about history are happening online. So it turns out that actually understanding how history operates online really does help us understand contemporary debates and contemporary geopolitical discussions. So I think that's another reason why the book has gained some readers, not just in academia, but in government, in diplomacy, even in the sciences, and even in other arenas like business and corporate journalists as well. Another thing the publishers told me when I was working on the book is they told me that I better get it out soon, because what happens if people are no longer using social media in 2022 or 2023? Well, we are still using social media. This is an updated version of the graphic that I showed you before. This is from 2022. And you'll notice that there have been some changes. So TikTok is now on here. TikTok users watch 167 million videos every minute of every day. Staggering amount of content, 167 million every single minute. Twitter users now posting 575,000 tweets every minute of every day. What's interesting about this graphic, I think, is a couple of things. One, social media has not gone away, but it is evolving. And it's evolving more towards live content. When you think about something like Clubhouse, which is live chat, you can go live on Instagram, you can go live on YouTube, you can go live on Twitch, you can even now go live on Twitter, right? So I think social media is increasingly becoming not just a posting and sharing environment, but actually a live streaming and broadcast environment. The biggest challengers to things like Hulu and Netflix are Twitch and Twitter and YouTube, right? So social media is becoming as much about entertainment and broadcasting, and that's kind of the direction it's moving, as it is about posting and sharing and family connections or friend connections. And so I think that has interesting implications for the future of social media, the future of information, the future of history and media literacy, et cetera. I think we're still sort of sorting those out. But the other thing that's interesting about this, and I realized this while I was working on the book, is that actually the way people communicate about history online stays fairly consistent from time to time and from platform to platform. In other words, once people learn what types of history content does well on Facebook, they'll actually take that and just move it on to TikTok, just slightly tweaking it for the new format and new medium. It's almost as if social media teaches you how to behave. And once you learn what behaviors work well on social media, you take them with you from platform to platform. So actually understanding how history got communicated on Facebook in the 2010s gives us insight into what history on TikTok will look like in the 2020s, right? Knowing something about the history of history on social media actually gives us insight into the present and the future of social media, because the way that we communicate online tends to stay actually very consistent from platform to platform and from place to place. While I was working on the book, the Frameworks Institute also came up with a report that verified what I already suspected, which was that pop culture, social media, and the news media were playing an increasingly larger role in the way the public thinks about the past. And that report is cited in the book. Okay, so that's a little bit of the preamble leading up to the book. And in the time I have left, let me tell you a little bit about what's in the book before we get to Q&A. So as is evidenced by history communication and history communicators, the term that I coined a few years ago, I like coining terms. I like coming up with new words for things. And so in this book, I have a new term, and that term is e-history. So I'm going to use the examples of e-commerce as a way to get into what I think e-history is and why I'm comfortable using that term to define billions and billions of pieces of content online. So my argument is going to be the following. In the same way that we have commerce and e-commerce, we now have something called e-history. So what is the difference between commerce and e-commerce? Well, if I walk into a store and I buy something and they give me a good or a service back, that's commerce. If I go to Amazon.com, I buy something online, they ship it to my house, that's e-commerce. So what's the difference? Now, I'm going to argue the difference is twofold. Number one, obviously, it's the location where the transaction happens, right? So e-commerce happens in a digital environment. But number two, there are certain mechanisms that have to be in place to make e-commerce possible. In other words, there has to be a way for Amazon to take my credit card information and send it securely and encryptedly to a server. That server has to talk to a warehouse. That warehouse has to talk to a driver. The driver has to know how to get to my house to deliver the good that I required. So there are particular mechanisms that have to be in place that make e-commerce possible. And I'm going to argue that the same is true of e-history. So e-history is both about where the historical transaction occurs. I post about history, I learn about history, I comment about history, etc., in a digital environment. But two, it turns out there are very consistent mechanisms behind the scenes that make e-history possible. And if you understand those mechanisms, it actually gives you insight into why certain e-history becomes visible online and why other e-history you will never see. And this is one of the reasons why the State Department and the European Union have taken an interest in this book, is because when you think about disinformation campaigns that leverage history, for example, it actually becomes quite useful to realize what mechanisms of the social web they are leveraging in order to achieve visibility and influence online. If you understand those mechanisms, then you can, one, try to counteract them, but two, you can also try to educate people on what to look for and how to identify them. So this book becomes as much about media literacy and information literacy online as it does about history, if you understand the mechanisms behind the scenes that make e-history possible. So on the very first page of the book, there is a definition of e-history. By the way, the word e-history is sort of like deer in the English language. It is both plural and singular. So e-history is our discrete media products that package an element or elements of the past for consumption online and which try to leverage the social web in order to gain visibility. The past is a very big place. You can't tell all of it in a very small space of your phone or in one single tweet. So invariably, all e-history is selecting an element or elements of the past and packaging it into a media product for consumption on the social web. That's part one of the definition. But most importantly, all pieces of e-history are trying to get seen in your newsfeed. Because if they can get seen in your newsfeed, then they can achieve influence and they can shape how you think about the world and about the past. So all e-history is striving to achieve visibility. And the way that they achieve visibility is by leveraging the mechanics of how the social web works. Right? If you didn't want it to be visible, you wouldn't put it up online. You wouldn't put it up online if you didn't want people to see it. Now, maybe you want 10 people to see it, maybe you want 10 million people to see it, but all e-history is fighting to get seen in your newsfeed and be seen by you on your device. Well, that's why I feel comfortable saying that all 58 billion videos about history on TikTok and all 48 million on Instagram, those are all examples of e-history because they are all packaging an element of the past for consumption online, and they are all fighting to leverage the mechanics of how the social web works in order to show up in your newsfeed and on your phone. So let's go back to this video. This is a very successful piece of e-history, right? It achieved high visibility. If I was to put up a video about the Civil War tomorrow on my YouTube page, it might get 25 views. This one got 30 million, right? So how did this piece of e-history become so highly visible? What mechanics of the social web did it leverage in order to achieve visibility? Well, the first thing I need to tell you about this video is when it was released. So this video came out in the summer of 2015. Now, some of you may remember what happened in the United States in the summer of 2015. A white supremacist walked into an African-American church in Charleston, South Carolina, and murdered 9 Black worshipers, leaving the 10th person alive to tell the story. And when he was found the next day in North Carolina, he was found with the Confederate flag sewn on his jacket. So this prompted a huge debate in the United States about the Confederate flag and its role in American life. And that debate was fiercely litigated online. So it is not a surprise that this video was released in the wake of that shooting when the Confederate flag was a highly visual symbol that was on everybody's mind, right? It leveraged what I talk about in the book as being the newsworthy past. Sometimes in the news cycle, elements of the past come up. And so that is a great time to release a piece of e-history. Because if you had released this piece of e-history a year earlier and a year later, it may not have had as much salience or as much relevance online. But because it was tied to the news cycle and the newsworthy past, it was managed to accumulate a lot of views. But there's something else I need to tell you about this video, which I haven't told you. By the way, there are other mechanisms that this video leverages, but I'm going to skip those for now just for the sake of time. But the most important thing I told you about this video is that it was actually not created by a historian. It wasn't created by a journalist. This video was actually created by PragerU, which some people may be aware of, but PragerU is a conservative political action committee in the United States. And PragerU's stated purpose is to counteract what it perceives to be as a liberal heterodoxy on university campuses in America. So this video's purpose was not actually to educate people about the Civil War. This video was to use a newsworthy event and a highly charged political symbol as a means to grant PragerU some authority in the eyes of online users as part of its larger goal to get conservative content into university classrooms and on university campuses in the United States. And in fact, it worked because PragerU is now being used in universities in Florida and Ohio and other places in the United States. And what I didn't tell you too is that during the time period that this video came out, PragerU was one of the top 10 political spenders on Facebook. And that is actually where this video accumulated most of its views. It accumulated some views on YouTube, some views on its website, but most of the views on Facebook. So when I talk to students, I like to use this video as an example, as a way to tell them that every piece of e-history has a story behind it. Who created it, why it was created, why it was released at a certain time, and what mechanics of the social web is it trying to leverage in order to achieve visibility. And when I spoke to students in Europe, for example, I showed them all these different examples and also had them think about examples from their own life that they've seen in their own social media feeds to start to ask critical questions about the history content that they see online. Who created it? Why was it created when it was created? Why is it showing up in your news feed? And what mechanics has it leveraged in order to achieve visibility? And that is part of the message that we're trying to do both with this book and with the History Communication Institute, is to bring some historical literacy into the conversation about media literacy and have people see that media literacy and historical literacy in this day and age are intimately connected. All these pieces of e-history, billions and billions of pieces. It turns out in this huge universe of social media content that e-history is everywhere. There are millions, in fact, billions of e-history videos, blogs, memes, etc., competing for our attention, advancing agendas, and actively reshaping what we know about the past. Some of these amass millions of views, as I mentioned. Others are barely seen. It turns out by leveraging the mechanics of the social web, you can figure out which ones are going to be seen by more people. Some are created by professional historians. There actually are professional historians out there creating e-history. Some of it is actually quite good. Others are made by journalists, history enthusiasts, hobbyists, white supremacists, conspiracy theorists, and even foreign disinformation agents. And in the book, I have examples of all of them. It can often be difficult to determine which e-history is created by whom. That last sentence, I think, is the most important sentence on this slide. I did a lot of interviews for this book. I talked to a lot of people. When you're scrolling on YouTube or on TikTok, all of this stuff shows up in the feed, right? One after the other. It becomes very difficult and puts a lot of onus on information consumers for them to decipher for themselves which e-history is quote unquote, good, and which e-history is not good or shouldn't be trusted. And in fact, a lot of people I talked to told me that, the principal feeling they have after consuming e-history is not that they've actually learned anything more about the past, but actually that they just kind of feel overwhelmed. And so this information environment that we're in, more information about history doesn't necessarily equal better information about history. And more information about history online does not actually lead to a better understanding of people's, of the past, right? People's understanding of the past. In fact, it can have the opposite effect because it can leave people feeling overwhelmed, confused, and like putting enormous burden on information consumers that they have to sort this out for themselves. And something else that I think is important to remember with all this is that accuracy does not figure into the equation in terms of visibility. So it doesn't matter how accurate your e-history is. That has no bearing on whether it will achieve visibility or not, or influence or not online, right? I can make the most accurate video in the world about the Civil War and put it up tomorrow. It doesn't guarantee that anybody would see it. But someone could put up an inaccurate video about the Civil War tomorrow and it could accumulate tens of millions of views. What matters is if it leverages the mechanics of the social web. The more it leans into the mechanics of the social web and how the social web operates, the more visibility it will get, regardless of whether it is accurate or not. And so that is one of the reasons why, even though there is billions and billions of pieces of e-history content online, some of it actually quite good, overwhelmingly, when I talked to people really didn't feel like they actually learned all that much from e-history. It actually principally had the outcome and the effect of confusing people, overwhelming people, and making them feel more confused than when they started looking at the material. So I only have like 5 minutes left at most, and I do want to make sure we get to questions. So in the last thing I want to share with you is this, and I'll try to make this as quick as possible so we can get to Q&A. The more I looked into this, the more I thought there was a bigger story here. And the question I kept asking myself and coming back to is, why does e-history exist at all? Like, what is really behind this phenomenon? When people in Silicon Valley talk about the web and new products, they always talk about what problem is it solving, right? So I started thinking about, like, what problem is e-history actually solving? And this is what I came up with. And this is also in the book. It said that e-history solves a problem, namely, how do you transpose the study of history into the web and social media? And the problem exists at heart, I argue, because the values that underpin the professional discipline of history are actually at odds with the values that underpin the social web. Professional history is an expert-centric, always evolving intellectual pursuit that is time-consuming and rests on its intrinsic value. But the social web is a user-centric, data-driven commercial enterprise that is instantly gratifying and privileges extrinsic value. And it's that clash that creates the conditions for e-history to emerge. So there's a lot of words in here. Let me break this down as quick as possible. Professional history, whether it's public history or academic history, I argue in the book, and I'm going to argue for you now, is at heart expert-centric. It rests on some level of expertise. To be a professor, to be a museum curator, to be a tour guide in a national park in the United States, you have some level of expertise to do so. And that expertise grants you authority. And all history, professional history, I argue, is sort of putting experts at the center of communicative power. Professors speak, students learn. Curators write wall text, visitors learn from wall text. Now, there's always a lot of give and take. There's a dialectic there. I'm not discounting that. But at heart, I think professional history, I'm going to argue, is expert-centric. The web, the social web, on the other hand, is user-centric. The web was designed to privilege the interactions of users, regardless of whether they're experts or not. And actually, some platforms were purposely designed to take power away from experts. In the book, I talk about the founding of Wikipedia, and the founders of Wikipedia purposely wanted to take power away from experts when they were building that platform. You look at what Elon is doing with Twitter right now, removing blue check marks for journalists and academics, for example. He is actually trying to take power away from experts as part of his design for that platform. So professional history is expert-centric. The social web is user-centric. So that's one clash. The second clash, as we know, when we think about professional history, we think about this always evolving intellectual pursuit, right? We're always learning new evidence. We're always uncovering new ideas about the past. Our understanding of the past never ends. It's always constantly in flux. Well, the web, I hate to break it to you, the social web is not an intellectual pursuit. It is a data-driven commercial enterprise. Everything about the web is set up to really generate ads. Even Wikipedia was initially established to generate advertising revenue. Social, Google and Facebook, these are advertising companies, even Twitter, advertising company, right? So it's all about user interactions and data-driven commercial enterprises that drive interactions. It's not an always evolving intellectual pursuit. That's clash number two. Clash number three, history is time-consuming, right? It takes a long time to do good history. It took me 5.5 years to write this book. It can take years to do an article or museum exhibit. But the web, on the other hand, promises instant gratification. It promises you an answer to your question right away. It promises you to get from point A to point B right away. The web is always trying to remove friction from the equation, make things as fast as possible, whereas history is a very high friction discipline. There's a lot of friction built into doing professional history well. So that creates clash number three. And clash number four, people who think about history, they always talk about history as it being valuable to society. It has a sort of intrinsic value, right? History is important because history is important. It's important to know something about history because it informs the way you think about the world. It makes you a better citizen and better participant in democracy. History is assumed to have some sort of intrinsic value. But on the web, nothing has intrinsic value. Everything is based on extrinsic measures of valuation, clicks, views, shares, etc. If I make a video with 10 views and I make a video with 10,000 views, the video with 10,000 views is more valuable than video with 10, even if they have the exact same information inside them. Okay, so what does this look like in practice then? You have to excuse my terrible PowerPoint art, but this is what I came up with, right? I argue in the book, and I'm going to argue for you now, that actually doing professional history on the social web is trying to take an expert-centric, always evolving intellectual pursuit that is time-consuming and intrinsically valuable, and putting it into an ecosystem that values the opposite, right? You're putting it into an ecosystem that is user-centric, data-driven, instantly gratifying, and extrinsically valuable. It's literally like putting a square peg into a round hole, which is why professional history is so hard to do well online and why we need a field of history communication, because we need to train people how to do this work, and we need to think critically and analytically about how this work gets done. Because it turns out just putting up expert-centric, time-consuming, intrinsically valuable work online is no guarantee that it will ever achieve visibility or that anyone will see it. And in fact, it's actually the opposite. What I found in my research is actually the more, let me just skip ahead to the final slides here. I know I want to wrap up here. The more that a piece of e-history is user-centric, data-driven, instantly gratifying, and extrinsically valuable, the more likely it is to show up in your newsfeed. And the more it is expert-centric, always evolving, time-consuming, and intrinsically valuable, the less likely it is to show up in your newsfeed. In fact, the e-history that achieves the most visibility and influence online actually is the e-history that conforms best to the values of the social web itself. So the more that e-history aligns with the values of the social web itself, the more likely you are to see it, the more likely it is to achieve influence and visibility. And increasingly, also, the more likely it is to achieve funding, right? And to be considered important. And so the more that e-history becomes user-centric, data-driven, instantly gratifying, and extrinsically valuable, the more it is considered to be valuable to society, the more it receives attention, media attention, funding, etc. And the more it is expert-centric, always evolving, time-consuming, and intrinsically valuable, then the more it is considered to be not publicly valued information, underfunded, and undersupported. And we are seeing this in the United States play out, as we speak. I could give you a number of different examples about how expert-centric, always evolving intellectual work that is time-consuming and intrinsically valuable is struggling to receive funding, struggling to receive media attention, and struggling to achieve visibility online and on social media, whereas increasingly the e-history that is user-centric, data-driven, instantly gratifying, and extrinsically valuable is receiving the attention and the funding and the accolades and the support. So to me, this is the real eye-opening thing that I learned while thinking about the research, is that in order to do e-history well online and to achieve visibility and influence, you have to find a way to merge this idea of expert-centric with user-centric. You have to do expert-centric work in a user-centric way. And that is, I think, one of the challenges of why history communication is so challenging. And it also applies to the sciences and other disciplines as well that are expert-centric, time-consuming, and intrinsically valuable. So this is one of the reasons why we've created the History Communication Institute, is because we want to train, we want to do more research, we want to do workshops, we want to do collaborations, we want to find ways to sort of figure out this puzzle and make the online ecosystem a better place for accurate historical information. We've already been working with tech companies, with governments, State Department, et cetera, and with universities, exploring partnerships and things that we can do together. So if people here are interested, I'd love to chat more about what that could look like and how that we can make the information online accurate, more accessible, and more visible to people. That privileges the types of values that we want to see in the world. I mentioned that we talk about all these things in my newsletter. That is the second address here, which I'll put in the chat, the Substack address. That's where we sort of talk about examples of e-history that we see online, as well as some of the developments and things that we're doing. One of the things we're about to release with the History Communication Institute is we're about to release a statement about artificial intelligence and its effects on history. So that'll come out next week. So if you're interested in that, please do subscribe to the newsletter or follow me on social media. And if you want to support the book, there's obviously lots of different ways to do that, which I'm happy to talk about. And with that, I will wrap up and thank you for your attention. I hope that by moving quickly, I was still able to get to the key points, and I hope that there's enough here for us to converse about. So thank you.
Okay, thank you, Jason, very much. Of course, we all realize that instrumentalizing the past has been going on, I think, since the invention of history. But you have clearly shown that we are now in a different kind of ball game. And especially the move from, as you wrapped it up in the end, the sort of expert-centric way and the time-consuming intrinsic value way towards the way how the web functions is calling for major changes in the way how we communicate. And you have been speaking about history, but of course what you tell about history applies also to other expert-driven kinds of knowledge. So I would like to open the floor. Please raise your hands in case I don't see all of you. Jason, perhaps if you switch off your slide, then the participants are visible. So who would like to speak first?
Well, there's actually a question in the chat from Giuseppe, so I could address that if we want to start with that.
Start, yeah. What you said applies to all science. That's what I just say. What's special about history? Okay.
Yeah. So I think this is a yes and question. So yes, it does apply to many other expert-centric, time-consuming, intrinsically valuable disciplines, which is one of the reasons why the book has been read by people outside of the field of history. There's a lot of science communicators who are interested in this book, people in anthropology, sociology. So yes, there is a lot of similarity, and a lot of these dynamics still hold true, which is why I think the book makes a valuable contribution. However, as I articulate in the book, there are actually some things that are sort of unique about history. One of the things that I talk about in the book is that e-history often relies on the premise of being the antidote to your regular run-of-the-mill history, right? There is this perception, particularly among non-historians and people I spoke to for the book, that history is boring, it's unexciting, and it's dull, right? And so a lot of e-history leverages this sort of surprise mechanics of the web, right? The sort of the opposite of what you expect in the way that the web works and sort of the way headlines are written, as a way to position itself as sort of the antidote to professional history. And that's what I was talking about earlier, that like a lot of these dynamics you see on one platform in one moment in time actually show up on other platforms in other moments in time. So there's like this whole genre out there of e-history that is just premised on being the opposite of professional history. And you see that on Facebook in the 2010s, and then you see it on TikTok in the 2020s. And it actually becomes a very surprising way, effective way actually, of generating visibility online. Again, because it plays into that notion of the opposite of expert-centric, the opposite of expert centricity, and also this notion of surprise, which works well on the internet online. So that was kind of unique, Now you can find stuff out there like science content online that sort of positions itself as sort of being the opposite of science. But there's not literally like a lot of content online that positions itself as being like the opposite to anthropology, or the opposite to sociology, or the opposite of philosophy. But there is a lot of content, there's a whole genre of e-history content that positions itself as being the antidote to your sort of run-of-the-mill history, because history does have this reputation, at least in the United States, as sort of being boring and dull and sort of not very engaging or entertaining. So I would say that there are dynamics in the book that certainly apply to other disciplines, but then there are very particular unique things that seem to pop out in the way that e-history content works online and how it achieves visibility.
Okay. Jason, now I want to give the floor to George and then to Paul. George. Unmute yourself. George, unmute yourself.
Yes, this is a prerequisite. Thank you, Helga, and thank you, Jason, for a very nice talk and the book. My question is the following. In my years at Cornell, I was fortunate to be a friend of Donald Kagan before he went to Yale. As you know, he spent his life writing a book on the Peloponnesian War. And I asked him one evening, Don, why did you spend your life writing a book on the Peloponnesian War after Thucydides, wrote his book, and then at least 100 others in the centuries in between? And he told me, never use the definite article, never say the history of anything. There is no such thing. Even Thucydides, with all the credit he is getting for being objective, he was an Athenian writing about a war between Athens and Sparta. And what he explained to me is that, you can get agreement on some facts, on dates and names and so on. But when you try to connect all this into a network with where the links are causalities, and it gets so complex that later, when you factor in biases, be they political biases, as you pointed out, or nationalistic biases, you have what we have today. What we have today in the world is a patchwork of national histories. You read a great book level book on history in Turkey and one in Greece, and they have nothing to do with each other. Both are biased in different directions. So e-history will just inherit all of this, I imagine. I can't see how it brings any, let's say, any move forward in resolving this factor that people look at what happened from very different points of view. And finally, a related question. There is, in the last few years, a move to develop something called global history or entangled history by people like Sebastian Conrad, Patricia Clarin, and others. It sounds wonderful, but does it really have a chance, especially in the social media world?
Ooh, tough questions. Well, I mean, ultimately, so what you alluded to with the idea about not being a singular history, I think most historians would agree with that. When we tend to use the article in front of history, we say a, not the. So he wrote a history of the Peloponnesian War, not the history of the Peloponnesian War, because the implies some sort of definitiveness. And we see history as an always evolving intellectual pursuit, as I mentioned. Well, the web doesn't really care about always evolving intellectual pursuits. So it tends to not privilege those types of histories, and it tends to privilege instantly gratifying answers about things. Now, as you mentioned, those instantly gratifying answers about things can be laden with all sorts of different biases and inaccuracies. And they're not designed to resolve conflicting accounts of histories or to engage in intellectual, always evolving intellectual queries. They are designed with very particular purposes in mind. Oftentimes, it's just to generate clicks and views and shares. Sometimes it's to advance political agendas. Sometimes it's to advance the reputation of the person creating the piece of e-history. But largely, e-history is playing a different game than the professional discipline of history is. And that's one of the challenges, as you say, rightly so, that these new emerging fields of history, whether they be transnational history or tangled history, whatever the new nomenclature is, are going to struggle in an e-history environment because ultimately e-history privileges different things than those professional disciplines do. And if those professional disciplines can't generate the funding to do their work, then they're certainly going to struggle because there's not going to be any around to support them and ensure that they can do the always evolving intellectual work that they are set up to do. So I think part of my message that I've been talking about this book, especially with governments, is to remind government that they have a responsibility to ensure that always evolving intellectual work has the funding and support that it needs to continue and to evolve and to keep digging and finding new histories and uncovering new sources and looking at things from new angles. Because if we solely privilege and fund the information we see online and we think that e-history can be a substitute for all history, then the entire disciplines will potentially disappear and no one will be left to do that hard intellectual work of unraveling and weaving together all the various narratives into something that is comprehensible. And at least in the United States context, we're having a real struggle with that. There's really only one place left that funds the sort of always evolving intellectual historical work that is necessary, and that's the National Endowment for the Humanities. There's really nowhere else that consistently funds history work in the United States. Many of the large foundations have pulled out of doing of funding that type of work. And increasingly, history departments across the United States are being cut or being consolidated. Professors retire and their positions are not replaced. So we really do need to continue making that argument forcefully that always evolving intellectual work requires funding, and we cannot just rely on the e-history we see on our phones because that e-history invariably is trying to do something very different than what the professional disciplines are trying to do.
Okay. Paul?
Jason, thank you so much. That was really brilliant and very fascinating. I was wondering whether you can lift the veil a little bit about the technology, and perhaps we should also talk about AI, because you're making this very interesting connection between technology and all kind of social constructs, including histories and experts that are involved in that. And I was just entering into ChatGPT, prepare a social media story about the assassination of President Kennedy, and I got it. And then I said, prepare a story about the assassination of President Kennedy as a conspiracy of the mafia. And of course, you also get a story, and an exciting story. So I'm wondering, do you have, can you say a bit more where the technology might be moving in order to perhaps still be as interesting as social media is, and yet also give kind of do justice to the community of experts?
Yeah, great question. It's obviously the technology is changing so fast. It's sort of like once you feel like you have a handle on it, it's moving. You know, one thing that's very interesting about this book, that the process of writing the book. So as I mentioned, I was writing this book in the 2018 to 2021 period, where obviously social media was the huge concern in the public sphere, everybody debating public, you know. When I talked to my contacts in Silicon Valley, though, for this book, none of them wanted to talk about social media. They all wanted to talk about artificial intelligence, right? So while the public is in a tizzy about this technology or that technology, we always need to remember that Silicon Valley is usually 2 or 3 steps ahead of us. You know, so now we're in a tizzy about artificial intelligence, but they're already working on the next things coming down the pike, right? And by the time we wrap our heads around artificial intelligence, they'll already be rolling out the next generation of products that are going to rapidly and dramatically change our world. So that's one thing that I always think about when it comes to the technology, right? In terms of artificial intelligence and particular things like ChatGPT, I mean, you guys know this. I have to explain this, though, to people who are not as, well-versed in the field. That these tools are not designed to make truth claims. They're designed to predict language, right? So basically, they're trying to predict what word comes after the next word. And based on trillions of pieces of information online, they can make predictions about what should be in a sentence and if that sentence can make sense. And it's actually pretty amazing that they can do that. But there is nothing in these technologies that is in any way predicated or grounded on the idea of accuracy or truth, right? It just knows that if you put Elon in a sentence, the most likely next word is Musk. And then it knows that the next most likely word after that is CEO of Twitter. And so it can put together a sentence that says Elon Musk is CEO of Twitter. But it has no idea whether that sentence is accurate or not. It doesn't really care if the sentence is accurate or not. So I think one of the big failures of this rollout of ChatGPT and large language models is we actually haven't told people what they're supposed to be doing and how they work. It's been a huge media literacy and education literacy failure on the part of Microsoft and other companies, as well as on the part of civil society more broadly, because people are using these tools in the same way that they sort of ask Siri or ask Wikipedia for answers, but that's not what these tools were designed for. These technologies are going to have all kinds of different uses and implications. And you could imagine disinformation campaigns that leverage these technologies to pump out, misinformation about history or about politics 24/7, 7 days a week, 365 days a year without end. But you could also imagine, academics and scholars using these materials to parse large corpuses of data and to crunch large universes of data that otherwise humans wouldn't be able to do. So I think that, we need a lot more education about what these tools actually do and what they can't do. The companies need to be much more transparent about what these tools do and what they can't do. And then we also need some regulation around what these tools can be used for and what they can't be used for. And I think because Silicon Valley is always 2 or 3 steps ahead of us, we're just figuring that out now when they're already on to the next technology that's going to rapidly change our world.
Jason, we are coming to the end, but Hannes still has a question and then we have to wrap up. Hannes.
Apologies that I take so long to answer questions. Once you get a historian started talking, we never stop.
Well, thanks for your presentation and the thoughts you brought. I have 2 related questions. One is there research whether the e-history content-wise is different from the normal history? Is there a different story told about past events? And the second one is, we normally say the web is more democratic because there are more users, there are more producers and things like that. Can you also observe in the e-history some phenomena of democratization, both from the producer side as well as from the reader side?
Jason, I just want to add one short question to this. You emphasized repeatedly the instant gratification, but you also said before that users end up to be confused, overwhelmed. So how does this kind of dissatisfaction affect, in your view, the possible future? I mean, if people end up being confused and overwhelmed, why are they still continuing to use it? So the gratification must diminish. That's my last question. I'm sorry, we have to close the question period now.
I will be very, very brief. And I'll also, there's a question in the chat. Wikipedia was originally set up to run ads. Yes, it was. If you look at the chapter 3 of my book, I detail the founding of Wikipedia. The original intention was for it to be based on advertising revenue. So there's a whole story there in the book, which I encourage you to look at. Helga, to your question, one of the reasons people still consume all this content is because they're addicted. And so that instant gratification may not necessarily be in terms of knowledge, it's just on feeding the addiction, right? And I put this in my newsletter a few months ago. You know, I was talking to a kid at Starbucks. He told me he spends 7 to 8 hours per day on TikTok. And he admitted to me that he was addicted and he wanted to know how to stop using it, but he couldn't. So the instant gratification that you get from social media is not necessarily an intellectual one. It can be sort of akin to smoking a cigarette or pulling a gambling lever. But e-history has to feed into that addiction in order for it to achieve visibility, which is one of the reasons why I argue you don't actually learn that much from it. Now, in terms of Hans's question, there's a great book called The Myth of Digital Democracy. I encourage you all to read it if you're not familiar with it. I relied on that book a lot for the early portion of research of this book. It turns out that the web actually follows a very similar power law to other societies, other parts of society, where 20% of content gets 80% of the views and 80% of the content gets 20% of the views. And so because the web works on signals of attention, the more attention that a creator of e-history can generate, the more likely his or her content will show up in your newsfeed. So actually, while there's a lot of democracy in terms of who can create content, anyone can create content at any time, there's not actually a lot of democracy in terms of distribution and visibility of that content. Right. So that sort of creates an interesting paradox when we think about the web and its promises and whether it has held up those promises. Hans, I forget the other question that you threw in there. I can answer it quickly.
The other question was, it's related to that. Is that the history told in e-history a different one than told in, let's say, the expert history?
Yeah, so e-history content, it definitely tends to privilege the opposite of history, the opposite of what you expected sort of trope. And like I said, that shows up on Facebook, on Twitter, on TikTok, et cetera, because it's been a proven mechanism for achieving visibility online. And so once content creators realize that that leads to visibility, they repeat that pattern over and over and over again. So, when you think of, history books or history articles that are written, they don't typically have the headline of 10 surprising facts you never knew about the Civil War. But you get a lot of that in the e-history format because it turns out that conceit of being the opposite of what you expect, of surprise, of being the antidote to professional history actually works very well to achieve visibility online. And more creators who realize that, the more they use and create that type of content.
Okay, so Jason, I want to thank you, and I hope we can continue the discussion in Vienna in whatever format. And now I hand over to Peter.
Thanks, Helga. Let me just bring up the screen here. For the final notes, Jason picked Love Is Here to Stay by George Gershwin. He shared with us that that's because it's his grandmother's favorite song. I have now dug up a rendition by the New York Philharmonic conducted by Zubin Mehta. And before I play it, I will just announce the next event. So on June 27th, Kate Firth Butterfield of UT Austin will give a talk titled, "Why Does AI Need to Be Trustworthy?" and the axis of power between big tech and society. And I'll have the honor of moderating this event. So thanks to Jason for a great talk, Helga for moderating, and all of you for joining today. And see you on the 27th. And this is George Gershman.
Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.
Goodbye.